more important to identify people and then help them find food, or help them find food while you're identifying?
Question is, do I think it's more important? It's a question of sequencing, right? Is it more important to find people first and then? I don't have a particular view on that. I think what I'm trying to suggest here, most importantly, is that when you do actually try to find people to deliver these resources to and these provisions to, that'll be much more challenging than you would think. I mean, you know, there's this project I'm working on with some colleagues in the U.S., and in the paper I'm writing for them is that, you know, there's this common notion that, well, if you just simply universalize things, right, then it makes it easier. Because the opposite of universalizing things is targeting, right? So oftentimes opponents will say, well, you know, targeting is very costly. So if you just universalize, actually, through economies of scale, it'll be much more efficient. But the argument I want to make is that when you universalize, that last 20% is the most precise, or requires the most precise targeting imaginable, because they are, in effect, invisible. So it requires a different kind of identification process. Now again, I'm not at all suggesting what you need to think about are some draconian governmental ways of monitoring people. Markets have, you know, arguably do a very good job of identifying people that would otherwise be invisible. You know, that's another way of thinking about it. And so we work very closely, for instance, with folks in the B School and other economists in trying to figure out how do we leverage public-private partnerships so that you have governments working in concert with markets to identify. So I'm not trying to suggest we need to create a big brother type Orwellian system, but just to recognize, not to take for granted that the folks that you're trying to reach are going to be that easily reachable. So the sequencing doesn't matter to me, just know that it's not as easy. Yep.
When you identify a group of people who are injured, what information about that group would you want to find out and understand before you start to work to help integrate them or make them more visible?
That's a great question. So what kind of information does one want to get? Again, I don't want you to think of this as being so mechanical, right, in the sense that here, I went to go hear Professor Wong speak, and he's given me, you know, the diagnostic checkbook that I want to sort of checklist that I want to take out now in terms of how I make visible the invisible. So it doesn't matter. It's not really important, you know, to me, what kind of information or what kind of data you're gathering. It's just simply the act of actually reaching those who would have otherwise been unreachable. So, for instance, I talked about 600 million Indians without ID. Incidentally, it was very interesting. Last night there was a great article in the New York Times about the new mayor in New York as one of his broad social reforms in trying to alleviate poverty is to extend and hand out ID cards, or to provide ID cards. So it's quite interesting that what they're talking about in New York City is what they're trying to do in India. The Indian government actually has undergone a campaign of distributing ID cards. In fact, quite sophisticated ID cards. But what we're finding, at least in the very small samples that we're doing interviews with, or that we've read data from in which interviews have been done, is that people know that these ID cards are important, but they don't really know what they're for. So they know they're important enough not to throw away, so they just throw them in their drawers. So it's what's important here is not just simply the identification of people, but it's also identifying people and conveying to them the importance or the benefits that can be accrued from using that form of identification, right? So one of the reasons why the argument made about the UID, Universal ID system in India, as being really kind of a failure, is that you handed out or distributed these cards without actually conveying to people what they're for. And so they've become essentially useless. So the content of the data you're collecting is not important. It's conveying that the identification is important in the delivery of a particular service.
What's your example of how you were calling for something, you know, was able to actually reach, and like they had the supply but were actually able to deliver, maybe like a tactic or method?
So let me give you an example, and I didn't talk about it in the actual talk, but one of the real engineering feats of the last 5 years has been the creation of the Tata Nano car. You've probably heard it. It's a real engineering marvel. It's the cheapest mass-made automobile, expected to completely revolutionize the existential realities of very poor people in India. It was supposed to revolutionize commerce, it was supposed to revolutionize micro-enterprise, supply chain management, and so on. It's been a dismal failure. And the reason why it's been a failure is because it was marketed as the car for poor people, right? So it was using market mechanisms, right? We're not going to identify people, but we're going to essentially say, we have this fantastic car, which is an ecological disaster, but we have this fantastic car for poor people. So now poor people, through market mechanisms, would be identifying themselves by purchasing this car. Well, as it turns out, it was a disaster because poor people didn't want to buy a car marketed to poor people. I mean, if you have any pride, you don't want to be driving proudly the car for, you know, people who can't afford anything else. That was a terrible failure. M-Pesa, which is one of the cases that I didn't talk about, one that we've written about. M-Pesa is a mobile banking system in Kenya. And among other things, you know, it's a very successful program because it leverages easy technology, already adopted technology, and so on. What I always focus on when I talk about that case, however, is marketing. The way in which M-Pesa marketed its mobile money system was not to market it to poor people, even though ultimately that was the market that Vodafone wanted to reach. They marketed it instead as an aspirational product. They marketed it to urban workers. Right? And then they threw in their marketing campaign, so urban workers, folks working in cities, and they threw in their marketing campaign, and this is great for remittances back home, for sending money safely back home, because now you don't have to carry it, you can just simply transfer it. And in so doing, through that marketing campaign, you not only signed up and identified through market mechanisms all of those urban workers, but all of their families back at home. So essentially, you cornered two market segments through a very clever marketing campaign. So I would suggest that's a pretty clever way of reaching people that otherwise would have been unreached. And hence, now, M-Pesa is considered a completely indispensable way of transporting, saving, and doing commerce in Kenya. Back there.
One thing that seems to dawn on our school's team as we do more research about India is this great disparity. You know, India is an economic powerhouse in many ways at the medical and technological forefront, and you know, miles away there is this invisibility, the urban slums and this rural poverty. So my question is, how does an outsider organization go about harnessing a marriage between what's great about India and the invisibility within India, and further, does the answer not lie within India itself?
Well, no, chances are the answer lies within India itself. So that's a great question because, you know, and it's foisted upon us all the time. So to give you an example, next week I'll be going to Burma, and I'm trying to set up meetings, and nobody wants to meet with me because they're sick of foreigners coming in telling them what they should do. Right? And that's completely understandable, so I'm going to try to charm them. But anyway, I'm not going to give up. But it's a completely valid question. The answers are there. Right? And so oftentimes, you know, one of the things that's very exciting about India is a culture of, or a discourse of frugal innovation, a discourse of creative, disruptive innovation. So there already is this kind of discourse there where folks are trying to find, through very low-cost means, innovative solutions to prevailing challenges. So you're seeing that. And I think partnering with, feeding ideas into that kind of pipeline, I mean, that's the kind of work that I would expect to come out of the Global Ideas Institute, is to sort of feed ideas into that pipeline so that they can be experimented with on the ground. The broader political question you asked, however, set against the broader political implications of the question was when you said this abject poverty set against this tremendous wealth. That's a major issue, and one that I get very frustrated with. It seems to me, as I've always argued, that the answer lies in some form of redistribution. I'm not talking about socialism. I'm talking about redistribution, building roads, your education, primary care, preventative vaccines. The unfortunate thing is, politically, that term is evil. Right? And so we have to be very clever in how we think about it and how we think about introducing that concept into the kind of work that we do. And markets actually are very effective at that. Right? So a lot of the answers that we're devising, I've been involved in a project with the London Business School on business solutions for poverty. If there are ways in which market efficiencies can reduce the fiscal leakage that we oftentimes see in redistributed programs, great. That might be one way of convincing folks that redistribution is not necessarily anti-growth or prone to corruption. But we have to be very creative about these kinds of solutions, and we have to be very creative about our political solutions as well.
I'm just wondering, what if the people living in slums, they want to be visible themselves? Like they voluntarily wanted to, because they actually benefit from it. And is there another way to solve the question, like deliver our service to them without actually making them visible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question, that's a fantastic question, is what, and that is that, what if there are invisible populations that want to remain invisible? And that's a valid question, it's an important question, and it's an empirical question as well, something that we can actually empirically verify. What communities want to remain invisible, and why do they want to remain invisible? So one of the interesting studies that was done recently was on water supply in the slums of Addis. And we do some work in Addis. 99% of the urban population there technically live in a slum. And the question is water. How do you get water into the slums, right? And so what you see in most slums, and those of you who've been to slums will know, most of the water pipes are above ground, right? And the reason why they're above ground partly is because there haven't been the infrastructural efforts to bury pipes. But it's largely because most people are tapping into those pipes illegally, invisibly. So one of the real interesting studies done on some of the slums in Addis is that there's this real entrepreneur who has mapped the entire water system, the illegal water system, throughout the slum, has figured out where the highest pressure points are, and sells that information. So you, as a slum dweller, might say, I would actually prefer to pay this person to tell me where to tap in illegally, rather than paying the state for getting access legally into a water supply system. That's totally valid, right? Now the question then is, how do you integrate an idea into that type of ecosystem? So you're asking the right questions. You're asking the right empirical questions to understand that social and economic ecosystem before you try to introduce something. Because I could tell you, the easiest thing to do to reduce respiratory disease as a result of cooking is put a window. Most people don't want it, for whatever reason, right? And that whatever reason is an empirical question. You have to go out, do the research, figure out what that reason is, and then try to introduce the intervention that way. Last question? Last question.
So we're trying to introduce a plan or solution to another country. Often I think the government in Europe is not as efficient as the ones in China. So how have you tried to cooperate with the global government?
So the question is, government is, particularly in your experience in the developing world, not as efficient as government sort of state apparatuses here, and then therefore how do we deal with them? It's a great question. It's a tough question. So this stove company we're working with in India, one of the questions we asked them was, why don't you plug into the food security initiative that is a national level policy enforced by the Supreme Court, which will require institutional cook stoves like yours? And their basic response is the amount of transaction cost added to interacting with government makes it not worthwhile of a value proposition for them. In other words, corruption, bribes, leakage, all these things add to the cost such that even a large procurer like government and the economies of scale that you can gain from that is not very efficient. So, one of the things sometimes, you're trying to create kinds of partnerships in which government sees some value in it as well. You see some political value in it in ways that is economically viable and so on. I mean, there are just ways in which you have to try to present this partnership that would be appealing to government. But in terms of actually having a magic bullet to figure out how to make governments less corrupt, more efficient, I wouldn't be a political scientist at the University of Toronto if I knew the answer to that. I'd be making a hell of a lot more money. Thank you.